Before that time.
The physics behind, for example,
another
reactions,
question people
the actual change in mass.
ultimate question is to evaluate
Over the course of 7 years, the book was put together.
Tonight, a conversation with Paula Jones, who is the founder of Adore, a dialogue on race and ethnicity, and an independent consultant specializing in multicultural competency and institutional change. At Focus, a reconciliation of spiritual disciplines, right here in the Scholars Chair. Yeah.
Let the conditions of inequality that we suffered under, when we are the oppressor, the dominant class, let's not impose that injustice on the others.
Anybody think that you could have a just system without giving women their rights?
Everyone has an opinion, and we sit around the marketplace and talk about opinion, but what is truth?
With the shareholder, their goal is similar to the business, to maximize profit.
That belief becomes a context for a development of knowledge.
Say physics is the DNA of technology because the rules for how you build new technology starts in physics.
Because Quran challenges the people. It's not only the people of the book, it challenges Muslims.
We say secular, they hear godless.
Right.
What was intended?
Watch the Scholars Chair every Monday night. Paula Coles-Jones, welcome to the Scholars Chair.
Thank you.
We are here today to discuss your article. The article that you wrote is titled Reconciliation as a Spiritual Discipline. And you're talking about it from an interesting perspective, from your own souls, between individuals within groups and between groups. Tell me, what was the inspiration for an article on reconciliation?
Well, I was invited to work with a church on reconciliation. After they had gone through a difficult period, I am a group facilitator. I design trainings. I lead groups through dialogue, often on difficult subjects. And so it was nice to be invited. And I was doing work in a room with maybe 60 or more people. And there was one person in the room that I had unresolved history with. Yeah. So that was okay. We did the work, but when I went home, it just kept nagging me. Now, as a facilitator, I have to be 110% present.
Yes, sure. Yeah.
Because I've got to listen to everything that's going on in the room and do my part too, right? And that nag just kind of was it was enough in the way that it made me stop and say, if I'm going to lead people through reconciliation, it has to be so real for me that the integrity comes through.
I see, yes.
So with that, I started journaling and figuring out, you know, what was it in that circumstance that I had. And that was the beginning of what has become a spiritual practice and to be shared with many people.
What in the case of analyzing were you trying to reconcile?
Well, and so it's interesting because a lot of times I don't need to reveal the particular details, and let me tell you why. Because if you really are doing reconciliation work, it's about changing the future, right? And so to bring the particular details in, that perpetuates the past. And so it was a relationship that I had where, you know, often in relationships we've got differences either of opinion or different approaches or whatever.
Sure.
And tensions can be there that never get addressed, but they live. They might live just inside of you and your body and your mind, or they might live between people, or even people who are around you who are experiencing that tension on some level too. So it was for me to be able to recognize that that tension mattered, that it mattered to me professionally, and then to do the work that I needed to do to let it go so it wouldn't happen. For me, part of reconciliation is about not carrying those things forward.
Yes, and try to find peace with it.
Yes.
Tell me, what is your definition? We always start the program with working definitions.
Yeah.
What is the definition for reconciliation?
So that's a good question, because the dictionary definition, which we always have to start with,
That's
right?
right,
Because that's where most people will go to get their definition.
That's
The
right.
dictionary definition is to restore friendship or to restore harmony. There's no real point in me writing the article if that were a sufficient definition. It's not.
Yes, yes.
If that was sufficient, we would have a different society, but it's not. And so my definition of reconciliation is finding out the impact of the actions, whether it's yours or someone else's, empathizing
Yes.
with people and correcting the behavior, correcting the problem so it doesn't go forward.
Now,
That's different.
Yes, it is different. And I assume that you have to start with defining the problem and discovering what the problem is and getting to the root of the cause, I gather.
It is, and that's perhaps the most difficult part.
Yes.
Discovering
I
what
am
the
sure.
problem is.
I've seen some of the work you've actually. I have participated in Adore, yes. And I found it very challenging for people who were participating, and including myself, because I had to deal with some issues that regarding race and reconciliation of race that I didn't have to think about before. And one of those things was defining oneself in ways that make it meaningful in that experience. So how can reconciliation be transformative? Tell us how that works.
Okay, so do we need to say what ADORE is first?
Sure, absolutely.
Since you brought it up.
Sure.
ADORE is an acronym. You know, you have to get these
right.
like sticky, right, acronyms so that people can relate to them and repeat them.
Yes.
But ADORE stands for a dialogue on race and ethnicity. So just so that your listeners know, it's a structured dialogue facilitated by a professional. So ask me your question again so I can...
You know, I was curious about how reconciliation can be transformative. Yeah.
It can be transformative on a lot of different levels. So ADORE is one piece, but let me go to a more personal place. I think that each of us has to reconcile for ourselves that something, whatever the something is worth our time and attention. That's a form of reconciliation in itself. So you could look at that in terms of being transformative, in terms of shifting your attention and your resources to a particular direction.
So the relationship has to have value?
Well, in this case, we're talking about individually. So let's say, so let me lay out the diagram. So there's intrapersonal reconciliation, where we ourselves have to come to a new agreement, a new decision about something. Then there's interpersonal, where let's say you and I then come to agreement around working something out. That agreement is not necessarily this nice kumbaya moment. It can be fraught.
Yes.
It can be very challenging. But there's the interpersonal piece, 2, maybe 3 people. Then there's an intra-group. So let's say that you're part of a social club and you've been having some challenges in the club. And that tension is just there. So every time you come, that nice social environment is not there because that tension is there. So the intra-group reconciliation would be how that group of people works it out, right? And then there's intergroup, where group to group working out the challenges and the issues so that you move together in a fair and equitable way. All of that's an important part of the background
It
in
is,
terms, yes, of how reconciliation can be transformative. In the adore setting, we are trying to help prepare people for the kind of, whether it's interpersonal or whether it's intergroup kind of reconciliation, could be intragroup, either of those. And I guess that complicates it, but that's what makes reconciliation meaningful, is that it has the complexity to encompass a lot of different settings. So let me say this. I think this is important. I see reconciliation as a competency. You know, we learn to do a lot of things. We have not necessarily been taught systematically to do reconciliation. So we bump into issues and people, and we can walk away and leave that stuff there, as opposed to reconciling and moving on.
Unresolved issues.
Unresolved.
Because we don't have the skill to get it done. You know, it is interesting because I see people revisiting the same problem year after year after year and never resolve it because they don't have the science of reconciliation and how that works. And I applaud the effort. I can say that the ADORE group that I meet with occasionally, there has been a lot of progress. I think the group know each other more intimately. I think they are more familiar with the problems in their case, they were dealing with racism and how it is impacting our society and how systemic racism works. And they were some people who were just understanding the problem for the first time, you know, and they were my age. So it's very interesting work that you're doing. And tell me, can you give us an example of how one can participate in reconciliation as a spiritual discipline? That seemed to be the spirit of your work.
So yeah, I do take it on as a spiritual discipline, but also it can be very secular and situational. As a spiritual discipline, if you care, if it matters, the quality of the relationships, then there's an internal barometer that lets you know whether things are right between you or right, you know, for someone else. And when it's not, well, whether it is or not, it can be a spiritual experience. But when it's not, it really calls us to give more. It calls us to a higher sense of purpose, rather than our immediate gripes or issues, right? It calls us to restore something that was lost. And whether it was lost in your time, in your moment, or whether it was lost historically and never available to you, as we talk about historic injustices, right?
Yes.
It's a spiritual experience to feel that, to come to terms with it, and then to begin whatever that process is for making yourself and the others whole. So it's a spiritual practice. Now, what makes it a discipline? I'll say for me, I would like to see myself having a completely reconciled life by the time I reach the end, right? Which means that, the relationships in my life are right.
Yes.
That everyone has been, the esteem that I hold for the people in my life around me, that all of that is restored. So that's a goal I've set for myself, right?
Sure.
So the practice is always being aware of whether that is present or not. The discipline is to do the work of correcting over and over again. And I was thinking about it as I was on my way here. Part of what makes it a discipline is, let's say that you and I had issues and we reconciled. It's not done then, because every time we interact, we transact that, right? That interaction. So the discipline is not repeating the past with each of those interactions.
I see.
I think true reconciliation changes the future. And when you change the future, you want to live into that new agreement and not drag the anxiety from the past forward. So you reestablish trust.
Reestablishing trust, and you talked about that quite often. That truth and trust was a main ingredient in dealing with your reconciling issues with another person. Tell me about this relationship that you have with Bishop Desmond Tutu.
You're quite generous. It's not a relationship.
What you can share with us on here.
Oh, well, so of course everyone, I think, pretty much knows him for his leadership in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa following apartheid, and that was around 1995.
Horrible environment to be in. They were just coming out of a segregated society, yes?
It was worse than segregated.
Yeah.
It was vicious.
Yes.
It was vicious.
How would you describe the environment, the context?
Oh my goodness, you're taking me to another place. Well, let me go back to Archbishop Tutu first. I want to say that I did get a chance to meet him in 2009 when I traveled with Reverend Bill Sinkford, was the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association. He and 3 others of us went to South Africa. And part of what we were looking for, we had a number of things to accomplish, but one was to look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission there. So I have to back up a little bit to say that this actually came out of some social justice work around the genocide in Sudan, right? So we're making all kinds of connections that were not in our original conversation. And in Washington, D.C., where the embassy for the Republic of Sudan is, there were protests organized by Joe Madison and Reverend Walter Fauntroy, who were, old-time kind of classic civil rights organizers.
Yes.
And the protests were happening on a daily basis. The goal was to protest until the embassy shut down because of the genocide that was taking place in Sudan.
I see.
Through a door, our dialogue on race and ethnicity in D.C., we learned about the protests and we started participating in that. And then I learned that there was a list of signatories on a letter against the genocide in Sudan, and I saw our association on the list. So it was like, oh, well, why didn't I know? So I started to pursue that. And there were people who were doing civil disobedience as a part of the protest to call attention to the situation. And I contacted the association president, William Sinkford, and asked him if he would participate in the civil disobedience. So he gave it some thought, and he said that he would. And he came down and he was arrested with Danny Glover and Bill Fletcher. And after that happened, they started making plans to actually visit Sudan. It was interesting because I was invited to go. I had gotten my shots and visas and all of that. Wow. And then Hurricane Katrina hit. And so we turned our attention to what was most immediate. That visit to Sudan would have actually been a visit to the refugee camps in Chad because it was too dangerous to go into Sudan.
I can imagine, sure.
All right.
Sure.
But we had to put those plans on the shelf. So a number of years later, the invitation came back again. And this time it was a broader trip. It was a pilgrimage to Africa that included South Africa.
So tell me, South Africa is coming out of this incredible, just putting a little bit in context, this incredible seizing of racial tension, to put it lightly, but they are dealing with a mass genocide that we haven't seen in some time, and that Tutu is now trying to heal this society, and he starts to establish this truth and reconciliation system. I'll call it a system of talking, allowing what to happen. The Africans talking to the whites, South Africana, and why did he do it in the first place? Why was the Truth and Reconciliation formed?
Yeah. You might be interested to know that Truth and Reconciliation Commissions have been formed in at least 33 countries.
That's good to know.
Yeah. So it's a way of, once a country has had really horrible things happen to the people, that the government or the state is in some way holding itself accountable for state-sanctioned violence against the citizens. I think that's one of the dominant ways that it's used. And so in South Africa, it's well known that black Africans and people of color were treated as second-class citizens. Now, I was surprised. When I got there, I had to just do a crash course so that I could really get the lay of the land and understand the history and the environment that I was in. And it was a bit of a surprise to me to realize that apartheid was really a very modern form of governance.
It was, yeah.
A modern form of governance. And there were communities that were much like communities here in this country, or the Harlem Renaissance, you know, when there was a real flourishing of culture and community in people of color communities. And apartheid took that away. It literally took people's homes, it took their lives, it pretty much turned people into indentured servants. In a sense, it separated families, something we're listening to happening now in a different context.
So I'm just curious that Tutu has this horrendous backdrop to the experience. How is he using reconciliation and the tools of reconciliation to heal the society?
I think that he understood that there was no way for people in South Africa to live together as equal citizens, not that they are, but maybe they are. But there was no real way to heal without the experience being heard of the people who were most harmed by what the government did.
That's interesting. Now, you had said in your article that some people confuse reconciliation with apologizing and or forgiving for the actions of someone. And I think you attended a lecture and you said that apologies only help the person who's offering it to someone. It doesn't correct behavior. It doesn't change the future, as you just said. How does reconciliation do something different? Does it demand something different from all the participants?
It does.
Yeah.
It does. With reconciliation, one, it happens as a result of actually understanding the impact of the actions. And you know, we could talk about South Africa and the Truth of Reconciliation, or we could talk about a one-on-one situation. But if you're only left with your own thoughts, and let's say I push you and knock you over, and I apologize, and I keep on going. Do you have the burden of having to accept that apology so that I'm okay without ever knowing how you feel about it? That's how apologies are. How often do we say, oh, I'm sorry, and we keep on going, and we really don't care.
Yes, yes.
We don't hear it, we don't feel it, we don't care it. And I'm going to say this. I actually think that feelings and emotions are an important part of change, important part of transformation. And I hope this doesn't get too complicated, but I think about feelings and emotions as the biochemistry of change. So, you know, we've got our thoughts and what we do, but there's a corresponding chemical reaction that's happening in the body.
Yes, yes.
You know, and we feel it. And a lot of times I think those feelings prevent us from doing reconciliation because we withdraw from the situation because those feelings start to bubble up and we kind of tamp them back down. Right?
For honesty, you have to be honest about that.
Yeah, yeah, and that's a difficult situation for people. But so to get back on track with the question that you had asked me.
The whole gist of the question is basically to get down to how this transformation happens in reconciling all these dynamics.
Yeah, on that, you know, part of how it happens is that if you're really doing reconciliation, you're open. It's almost like walking in the other person's shoes, right? You're open for a period of really experiencing on some level what the other person may have experienced.
Yes.
And that you asked about the difference between apology and forgiveness. With apology, you don't have to do any of that. And with forgiveness, I talked about that early situation I had where there was a person in the room, I had unresolved history, I went home and I drew the conclusion, it's like, well, I can forgive so that we could move forward because we were there to produce a different outcome.
Yes.
And I finally let go of the past. But the other person had no idea about my feelings and experiences, and that all those years I had a certain experience. I have no idea whether or not they had some corresponding, maybe not.
Yes.
Maybe it never registered for them. But I did forgive. So forgiveness, it may have changed it on some degree, but it didn't really change who we were.
Yes, the core.
Yeah.
The core and the motivating idea that causes a person to do things like racism. We're almost at the end of our program, and I want to get your definition of racism, and I think I will just for 30 seconds. What is your definition of racism?
So I use a wider a definition that's widely accepted by people in the activist community. Racism is personal prejudice plus, which is backed by institutional power. So personal prejudice plus the misuse of institutional power, with the idea that everyone has prejudices. You know, that's not the big deal. But whether or not you can use your prejudices to limit access or to do harm to people who also should have access to those institutional services, that's what makes racism racism. So you've got a systemic problem that we often put on individuals about personal prejudice. They're different.
Yes, and I'll gather that reconciling these differences require some real work and real effort and some real pain, as one of your articles, one of your sentences in your articles indicate, that pain is part of the process, and you have to have a little strength to make that transition.
Right, right. Pain can be part of the process, but the more we equip people, then the better prepared they are for those challenging moments.
Yeah. You have, in fact, nailed a scholar's chair for us. Paula, thank you for coming in. I must say that we've been talking to Paula Jones concerning reconciliation as a spiritual discipline. I am Khalil Shadid. Good night.